Hi, everybody. My name is Amanda Jacobs. I'm the Vice President for District Partnerships at Learning Ovations. We're here today to talk about designing equitable K-3 literacy programs through the science of reading research. That's a mouthful. Why are we here? Learning Ovations is actually a company that has worked with different leaders in San Bernardino County Superintendent's Office in the past. We've got over 14 years of research proven supports through our ESSA Strong assessment to instruction platform, whereby we're able to support teachers' capacity in delivering daily differentiated instruction by applying the science of reading in order to support every student being able to get their needs met in the classroom by way of supporting teachers' capacity to do that in daily instruction. We have with us two incredibly awesome, gifted, talented speakers for us today. Dr. Sarah Siegel. Sarah, can you give us a wave?
Hello.
This is Dr. Sarah Siegel. She goes by Sarah. We also have with us our Director of School Outcomes on the West Coast, Genevieve Gadea. Thanks
Hi.
for Genevieve. We're going to be actually spending some time in three different ways today. First, we're going to dive deep and heavy into the science of reading. Dr. Siegel actually has a wonderful background in this, and she'll talk a little bit about that, really trying to unpack what is the science of reading. The next place we're going to explore is ensuring how equity is happening through differentiation. We heard Dr. Hammond talk today more specifically about how we can address equity and how we're thinking through intentional practice in literacy and across school systems. So we're going to talk about that. And then finally, we're going to actually look at how schools can do that with experienced from the field and from Dr. Sarah Siegel to now Genevieve Gadea's work right in San Bernardino County in Fontana, actually. So we're going to see what that looks like in action with all of these three pieces, really to help you think through how can you bring this information to your school system, really to support that K-3 equitable literacy programming happening in schools for reopening. That being said, Sarah, take us away.
Thank you, Amanda. All right. So as Amanda said, we are going to kind of start with some background in science of reading, a little bit of kind of a common base to build off of, but I'm sure you've never run into a long-winded academic, but just in case, I'm going to try really hard not to be one today. And so we can get to Genevieve's portion where we're really going to apply the information I'm going to give to you and talk about how it's actually being implemented in real schools, which I know is the most important piece of all of this. So forgive me in advance if I go kind of fast. If we have time for questions at the end, I'd love to hear them. If we don't, we'll share our communication information. We have a bunch of ways to follow up with us. So please, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions at all. I would love to talk more about this. So here we go. First off, we just want to start with kind of discussing this, what's really turned into a buzz phrase lately, the science of reading. And so I don't want to spend a ton of time on this content exactly, but I do want to emphasize a few points that if you've attended any science of reading webinars or seen any of the resources coming out lately, just emphasizing the topics that a lot of times are covered there. And so the first one that should look familiar is the simple view of reading. And then the second one is on the left hand there, the outcomes from the National Reading Panel, the 5 pillars of reading. So first off, the simple view of reading is really important. It's a great kind of foundational way to understand how reading develops. And so we know we want to get students to that reading comprehension piece on the right side of that equation you see there. And those reading comprehension skills are really coming from two places: word recognition, or the ability to decode, and language comprehension, or understanding the fact that words have meaning, and then that meaning can be used to communicate either orally or in consuming written text. And it's really important to think of this as almost 4 quadrants. So you can be really good at word recognition. You might be an English learner who can decode, but doesn't have the language comprehension ability to understand what you're decoding. And on the flip side, you may have a student who has been diagnosed with dyslexia, has really poor word recognition, but still really high language comprehension, especially if it's oral. So we know students' skills can fall into any one of these areas. And it's our role as educators to support them so that we can fully flesh out their skills on both sides of the equation and get them to that higher reading comprehension level. Then again, complementary information from the National Reading Panel. This simple view of reading is really made up of 5 critical components. So phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And kind of the combination of these 2 pieces of information led to a third image that you've also probably seen in the science of reading context, Scarborough's rope. And so this graphic is really helpful in just understanding the fact that, again, we still have language and word recognition, but now they're made up of all these other additional skills that not only exist as individual strands, but operate best together when we have fluency, automaticity, and together they equal this idea of skilled reading, or what I kind of like to think of as reading for understanding, right? You're experiencing written language and understanding what it is without a huge cognitive burden as you're consuming those words. However, there's two things I also want to point out about these kind of common theories presented in the science of reading. The first is that if you notice the citation at the bottom here, they're pretty old. So this is from 2002, and the previous slide had things from the late 80s. The reading panel came out in 2000. So we're not talking about cutting edge research from the research field, right? And the other thing is this kind of view of reading, while super critical and really forming the foundation of the research, it's not complete, right? It's just a portion of what it takes for a student to get to high level reading ability and proficiency. And so another thing that is not mentioned as often in the science of reading is the fact that there is this giant gap between research and practice. And a lot of times, we're experiencing it right now, we're working to fill that gap through this new research and communicating about it, but we really still have work to do. And so what that can lead to at times is some frustrated practitioners in the middle here and getting bombarded with a ton of information, but not really having a clear channel to get new research and really execute it in their classroom. And so that's partly why we're here today, and something that I just want to kind of talk about as a component of our conversation. So if this is just the surface, and this is kind of the foundational research, what else do we know, right? What is missing from this picture? So the first thing I want to present to you is why that research to practice gap exists. So I'm not going to read every bullet on this slide, but one big example, and actually a reason why I didn't choose to pursue academia in a research institution, was my frustration around this gap. And one example is the fact that faculty in a university, right, are really trying to improve their careers by publishing peer-reviewed journal articles. And all of these journal articles that are meant to inform educators in theory and really advance the field are behind a paywall for anyone outside of the university setting, right? So even if you put in the work, try to find these articles, we're really invested in tracking them down, they're really hard to access for anybody outside of academia. And so it's things like this that take that secondary step for people who are connected to the research world, like us, and like your county office for offering this, and really starting to bring some of this new cutting edge research into the classroom so that practitioners are not so frustrated and not being cut out of what is happening kind of on the front lines of the research field. Another piece of information that I feel like is kind of skipped over in some of the simple view of reading conversations, but Dr. Darling Hammond actually mentioned it in her keynote, is this idea that development is really critical as well as just academic skills. And so I am a developmental psychologist by training. So to me, that's an easy connection. Everything is development to me. But I really want to draw the connection here as it pertains to literacy instruction, because there's a huge difference in the way that language develops for our students compared to decoding or reading ability. And so we can think of this playing out as early on as an infant who at the bottom of the graph there you see is starting at about 6 months of age all the way over to 12 months or about a year. And the children in this study were exposed to 2 different languages as well as English, which they were hearing in their home all the time. And so on the far left, you can see between 6 to 8 months of age, when they were played sounds in Hindi or in a language that is written in the green text there. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. It's a pretty long word. But in these 2 languages that were novel to them, they could still distinguish phonemes that were not in English, but were found in these other languages. So you can see the blue line is almost 100% of the time they could distinguish between phonemes that weren't English. However, as early as a few months later, so from 8 to 10 and then all the way up to 10 to 12 months, their ability to distinguish between phonemes that didn't occur in their language dropped off almost completely. So now if they hear 2 sounds that are relevant for a Hindi speaker, but not for an English speaker, they could only even recognize that sound difference about 20% of the time. And so this is happening automatically. It's something the human brain does very naturally, and it takes less than a year to really develop these skills. It's also the reason, as a native Minnesotan, I still say things like bag or magazine wrong, but I can't hear the difference in my mind because those are just vowel kind of preferences that I was never taught to distinguish between as I was growing up in my Midwestern family. So we see this play out all the time, and it's happening naturally. On the flip side, we have skills that are tied to reading, specifically that word recognition piece of the simple view of reading, or what this graphic is calling decoding, this blue line. And that is not a skill that develops in the same way. It doesn't happen naturally. It does involve instruction. And so here we kind of have these two tracks that we're calling one vocabulary, or essentially oral language, and one decoding. And you can see the difference as soon as we start to consider development as part of the equation here. So right off the bat, we're now distinguishing phonemes. We're being able to recognize sounds and words. We're gaining language. You enter kindergarten with a pretty big vocabulary as a student. And those are skills that you're just picking up as you're exposed to the languages that are occurring around you. However, the decoding ability is pretty stagnant until you get explicit instruction in that area. And that's really the focus between kindergarten and third grade, is building up those decoding skills so they can meet oral language or vocabulary ability. And that's what we're so focused on at Learning Ovations, is bridging that gap from kinder to third grade so that students can make the transition that's so critical in fourth grade from learning to read to reading to learn, right? What you've done is if students are reading proficiently at the end of third grade, they can now start consuming new information through reading instead of struggling through the decoding tasks that are involved in reading itself. And so this really kind of allows us to tie in not only the simple view of reading, but also the factor of time. And then there are a few other areas that the current research has really advanced in over the past few years. And one of those is neuroscience. So this graphic just illustrates the fact that while language ability, just like we described with the infants, is an innate and actually has a centralized location in the brain, reading does not. So when you're practicing reading and decoding skills, you're actually strengthening the connections between portions of the brain, not a specific area. And this is, again, why it's so important to think about development and the fact that students need time not just to learn, but to practice the skills they're learning to strengthen these connections and improve their literacy ability. In addition to this idea of the brain connections, neuroscience has also given us evidence that shows about 30% of students have the capability of learning to read sort of regardless of instructional quality. And about 50% of students have the ability to learn when they had experienced high quality tier 1 instruction. And so we want to be forming those connections that I just displayed for as many students as possible, which is going to be a baseline of about 30%, but with that additional 50% who can learn if they're receiving the instruction that they need to be successful. And then finally, there is about 15% of students who may need tier 2 and tier 3 support. It may take them a little bit longer to get there, but they are also cognitively capable of reading at grade level. And then finally, we see about the 5% that do have severe cognitive impairments and might not be able to reach exactly grade level proficiency. But we would be expected to see that elementary students who are all experiencing exactly what they need and receiving tailored instruction can be reading about 95% of them. So then one final takeaway is, just like Scarborough's rope, all of these different characteristics and pieces of research need to be woven together to produce better outcomes for students. And so the same is true for exactly what's happening in the classroom. We know a lot from the research and from just practical experience about what doesn't work, because there's not a single one-off solution. So on the left-hand side there, you can see a bunch of different methods that I know might look familiar to you that districts and schools try to put into place to really solve and address all problems. And what we really want to do is kind of focus on the table on the right and tying all these pieces together. So the science of reading is great, but on its own, it does not inform enough to really directly improve student outcomes, right? Having the knowledge and applying it are two totally different things. Same with the standards. And then we also know, as Dr. Darling-Hammond mentioned as well, we want to differentiate for these students, right? So we can't come up with a one-size-fits-all model for all of our students or for all of our teachers. And that means there won't be a single set of materials or a single kind of right way to accomplish this. We have to take all of the knowledge that we have and combine it with the skill set students have to meet them where they're at. So that's a really important thing to consider, no matter what kind of topic we're thinking about. And this is especially true as we go into next year, because the range of student skills we'd expect to see coming into our classrooms after this kind of untraditional year are going to be even more varied. So we really need to make sure we're meeting students' needs. So if that's kind of the science of reading 1.0, what about the science of reading 2.0? Where can we go next? Or how do we meet all these different needs now that I'm addressing? Because most of the work I just presented to you is based on a typically developing student, or making sure that you just get the biggest bang for your buck as far as something that can impact and improve outcomes for everyone. And the real key here is ensuring equity through differentiation, right? So now if we want to tailor our needs and our responses to the individual students, we're really going to see an even bigger shift in improving outcomes. And the way we think about that from a research standpoint is something called child by instruction interactions, or the idea that, simply put, different kids need different things to be successful. And while this may sound very, very obvious for all of you, in the research community in the early 2000s, this was kind of a novel idea for researchers, that they knew anecdotally they were hearing it, but they couldn't find evidence of this in their research. And so Dr. Carol Bonner went out and started observing real classrooms to see if she could identify how students were responding differently to the instruction they were receiving. And she was actually able to find these child by instruction interactions, or this idea that even students in the same classroom actually benefit most from getting tailored instruction. And so her work started at Florida State, and she was my mentor as we really developed some of the work that I'm going to walk you through now. But a key thing to keep in mind is what we're really talking about here is the fact that on the left, you would have maybe the science of reading type instruction, right? Every student is being boosted and receiving effective tier 1 instruction, but it's not tailored to meet their specific needs. And so on the right, we really want to have this equity focus where we're not giving students all exactly the same thing, even if it's evidence-based, but making sure that the evidence-based instruction they receive is actually meeting the needs and their skill set they're bringing to our classroom. And so this is the really critical differentiation between kind of that basis science of reading information and taking it to the next step, that second set of reading research that occurred, building upon that foundation that started with the simple view of reading. So what does that mean? What does that look like in the classroom? So through Dr. Connor's classroom observations, she was able to categorize everything in the English language arts block into 4 categories. So on the left, these probably are starting to look a little familiar. There are 2 categories: code focused skills, which is essentially that word recognition phonics component that we talked about in the simple view, and then meaning focused skills. This is anything that has to do with comprehending language, vocabulary, taking the meaning from language and actually understanding what we're talking about here. And those 2 areas can be presented in the classroom in 2 ways: child managed activities and teacher managed activities. So if an adult is leading the instruction, if it's being guided in a whole group, small group, or one-on-one session with an adult, a teacher, then that would be a teacher managed activity. So you could have a teacher managed code focused phonics lesson, or you can have a child managed activity. So this would be work done in a peer group, independently, or 2 students working together, but now the child is responsible for their own learning in these activities. And anything, again, that was observed could actually be categorized in one of these 4 ways. And what Dr. Connor's work showed is, depending on how students spend their time in these 4 areas, there are actually differences in their outcomes at the end of the year. So students need different amounts and types of these 4 categories to meet their full potential by the end of the school year. And one way we can kind of think about this is about students entering a 1st grade classroom in the fall. So on the left-hand side, you can see reading level. So you could have students in your 1st grade classroom entering with a kindergarten reading level, 1st grade reading level, even a 2nd or 3rd grade reading level. However, their needs at the beginning of the school year then are going to be very, very different. So a student coming into a 1st grade classroom reading at a kindergarten level benefits most from 30 minutes a day of teacher managed code focused instruction. They're going to need a lot of support understanding letters, connecting letter sounds, working on all of those phonics skills that they maybe haven't built up yet. However, a 1st grader reading at a 1st grade level only needs about 10 minutes a day of that same type of instruction. So if we want to really be meeting their needs, we also have to be cognizant of how much time they're spending in each of these 4 instructional areas. So then the real question is, if we've observed these practices occurring in the classroom, do they actually benefit students? How does this impact their outcomes at the end of the school year? And this is where our research really zeroed in on the effectiveness of these algorithms and these recommendations. So we conducted 7 randomized control trials from 2005 to 2011, and we found a positive and significant impact on student outcomes at every single grade level, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And then, in fact, we also conducted a longitudinal randomized control trial that found that students whose teachers had access to these instructional recommendations actually had a cumulative impact. So if teachers had access to this information in grades 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 94% of the students in those classrooms were reading at grade level by the end of their 3rd grade year. And that is exactly what our cognitive science graph would predict, right? If students get exactly what they need, their outcomes are reflecting that. And not only that, but we actually showed that the reading level was on a 5th grade level. So not only are the students who were struggling or needed additional support getting that support, but our students who are above grade level were continuing to grow. So we're really differentiating and tailoring that instruction. So how does that actually look in practice? So there are 2 ways we deliver this information to teachers in classrooms. First is the recommendations are produced through the A2I professional support system and platform. So this is a technology that is available online, and it includes the assessments that provide that student kind of profile, so we know what their needs are at the beginning of the school year, provides the data-driven recommendations, so those are the minute recommendations I showed you, and then it also produces an aligned lesson plan. So not only do you get the amount of time students need to spend in those 4 categories, so in teacher managed, code focused time, but we'll also align it to tell you, and this is an activity from your curriculum that would meet that student's needs. So we're able to not reinvent the curriculum piece, but provide still differentiated instruction within the classroom. And then finally, we know all of these concepts I just shared don't mean anything if they can't actually be put into practice by a teacher. And so we provide customized support to actually help with the classroom management and the just deeper literacy understanding that's required to really put this kind of differentiation using time and content into practice. And the way our customized support is developed is through 5 really critical components of this framework. And so all of these references to the right-hand side have links attached to them. We'll definitely share the slide deck after if you want to kind of investigate in more detail where these sources are. But what I want to highlight is just the 5 categories themselves, because this is what Genevieve is going to kind of walk you guys through. How does this look in a real district, right? All of these research concepts that I'm presenting, what does that mean for a district in California? So the first critical piece is differentiation, of course, and we've definitely highlighted why that's important. But another area is data usage. So we know having assessment data is important, but a report that came out from the Institute of Educational Sciences actually shows that just having data and even receiving coaching on that data isn't necessarily enough to move student outcomes, right? You have to also apply next steps that are meaningful and effective. So we really want to think about not just the data that we have, but what are we doing with it and is it making a difference? And then finally, there are 3 other critical components that are more kind of at the school level. And those include the instructional materials that are available, the classroom structure, and the teacher partnership. So do we have the kind of pieces that we need to put in place to actually differentiate as a teacher? And then am I actually open and willing to learn and ready to get the coaching I need to put all of these separate pieces into practice for my students? So again, Genevieve is going to go into a little more detail about what some of these components look like, but I am going to pause here for a second, hand the screen over to her, and if anybody has questions, now is the time for that.
All right, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead. And just like Amanda said, I've been working really closely with Fontana Unified School District. And my objective today is to really walk you through what that application looks like at the district level and share examples of like how we really support the teachers in implementing the science of reading in their instruction, and then give you examples of how Fontana has shifted their focus and shifted their practice in order to support this. So I want to start off with some data that we have just recently, and this is Fontana's historical and projected literacy levels. If you, this is specifically in 3rd grade. The orange is historical, green is current, and blue is projected. And so one of the things we want to highlight is with all of the craziness that this year has brought, I think all of us working with Fontana teachers and all of the support staff, we really expected that there was either going to be no growth or even moving backwards in terms of growth. But one of the things that we're noticing is not only are we projected to be showing growth, we're ahead of where they were historically. And so I think one of the things we can we noticed about Fontana is that the things that they kept consistent, right? Because there's a lot of things that they didn't have control over this year, just like other school districts, is the expectations for differentiation stayed consistent. Their consistent use of A2I the data and the recommendations, and then also their collaboration with us at the grade level collaboration meetings, and also one-on-one coaching. So I'm going to talk about the little things that Fontana did throughout the school year, and I'm going to focus on 3 areas. And the first area is like what Sarah spoke to about before, which is differentiation. And we know that this school year, this current year and then the upcoming year, right? We have to prepare for both virtual, in-person, and also even hybrid or high flex instruction. And so one of the things that we need to do really is maximize our time, right? And so if you're like, okay, Genevieve, we do have differentiation going on in our classroom, we wanted to make sure that we focused on certain things that we were noticing. And what we noticed is that there are some gaps and some holes in teachers' understanding of differentiation. So some common misconceptions were that I have small groups happening in my class, and I do differentiate within content. But like what Sarah said before in the science of reading, parts of differentiation that really haven't been focused on in the classroom are duration, or the time that's being spent, and the delivery, right? So how much time is being spent teaching decoding versus teaching meaning? And if Sarah is saying that each student needs something very different, is our lesson planning and implementation of that reflective of that? And so one of the things that we're doing at Learning Ovations is we are providing teachers with the technology so that they can get those recommendations quickly, right? So that is basically where we're spending a lot of our time this year, right? Is how do we help teachers plan differentiation during their synchronous work and their asynchronous work. And we have models of those and specific examples of how we have those recommendations and how we use them and apply them in lesson planning. We will link that here and share them with you. If we have time, which I don't know if we're going to have time, we can go through that also. But some of the shifts that happened in the district, they might seem like very tiny shifts, but those shifts really have attributed to their growth. One is just setting the expectation that we're moving from a whole group to small group, like no ifs, ands, or buts. The second part is that they started shifting the expectation of those small groups happening throughout the entire day and not just in their intervention block. And then lastly, they supplemented their support on how to really differentiate in those 4 quadrants that Sarah was speaking on, of teacher managed, meaning focused, and code focused, and then child managed, meaning focused, and code focused. And like, what does that look like when I'm actually planning my day with my students? Every student needs a little bit of different time with the teacher and different time on specific content. Does anyone have any questions on differentiation? Okay, so I'm going to go on to data usage. So one of the things that we know about data, right, that Sarah said, is it's not important to just have the data. It's important to also apply what we know from it. And so we know that this year we have a lot less time with our students, so a lot less time giving assessments. But even more to add to that is we kind of have this new struggle of like, now that students are taking the assessment, they might be having help from home. So are we able to provide them with a platform that's easily accessible so that we can constantly check if what we're seeing is accurate? So one of the things that we do have, right, Sarah spoke to it before, is we have that support. We help teachers give the assessment. We help teachers look at those recommendations. And I think the biggest part is that our assessment really informs what kind of instruction is happening in the classroom. So It almost takes all of the guesswork out for our teachers. And I think Sarah even touched on it a step further. It really ties the curriculum that you are currently using at your district and helps you find the pieces that are going to be the most appropriate for each group in your class. So we know going into next year, we might have groups just in one classroom at a grade equivalency from kindergarten all the way to fourth grade. So how do we really use the curriculum that we have to meet the needs of all those students? Fontana did an outstanding job of really shifting some of the things in their practice. One of the things is that they mandated the assessment across their entire district to align from site to site. They also set the expectation that when we do see small groups in your class, they should be based off of A2I groups. So, you know, we've seen in sites before where one site might be using running records, or even there's discrepancies within grade levels. Like one teacher might be using a running record to inform her groups, and another teacher might be using STAR early literacy. So one of the things they tried to do is really align that within their sites and also across the district. And then they also encourage them to progress monitor every 6 weeks, not just taking the assessment 3 times a year. And then they took it a step further, and they also wanted their support staff for that provide tier 2 and tier 3 interventions to be using those same recommendations from A2I. Okay, so I'm going to move to classroom structure. And the reason why classroom structure is such a huge component is because if we know that our students need different things, right? Some might need more time with a teacher, some might need more time working independently. We need to have the structure that's set in place where the students are working independently, but not only working independently, able to manage their learning independently. So some of the things we focused on this year, and especially going into next year, is what system or routine do you have in place so that students are managing their own learning? Okay, and especially this year, we were focusing a lot on how are we able to set up a system so students are able to work through distance learning, right? And so our support came in this year, and we worked with teachers at grade level meetings and also one-on-one, and we really dug deep and talked about all of those different models, because at the beginning of the year it was in person, and then it was virtual, and then it was hybrid, so it was constantly changing, and teachers were constantly having to take a look at what system they had and update it. So during our meetings with them, we were able to really look through all of those. I have models linked specifically on what models work the best for in-person, virtual, and hybrid, and we can talk about that later if we have time, or you can follow up with Amanda to get more time to talk about it, because this is one of my favorite parts. And then lastly, Fontana did, I think one of the biggest things that Fontana did was they invested a lot of time at the very beginning. They gave a lot of PD on how to explicitly set up those systems. They also gave their teachers permission that it may be 6 to 7 weeks in the very beginning where you can just devote your time to setting up that system, and we're not going to be looking for content. We really just want you to get the structure down. And then they also made sure that they had resources for them, especially digital resources this year. So I'm going to hand it off to Amanda, and Amanda's going to speak a little bit on just what it is that you can do if you have any questions, or if you're wanting to find out more. And I'll let Amanda have it back.
If there are any questions regarding specific supports, what we are actually offering to support schools with right now is, if we're thinking about a K-3 plan, really supporting students with what they need, that means we need to support teachers in their capacity to do so. So something we're sharing with you all today is a framework analysis, really an opportunity to answer 13 questions using our A2I framework. And our response there, your responses will then be brought back to our team to really dissect and inform you all with some specific next steps to think through your K-3 literacy plan and program going into next year. So if you look at that link that says www.learningovations.com/framework analysis, it'll take you to a web page. You can answer 13 questions there. Our team will work with getting back to you on the information you provide and setting up a report so you can think through what does it take, what could it take, what is the direction we can support our school K-3 program in to really think through the opportunities to build capacity for teachers to be able to deliver daily differentiated literacy instruction K-3 for that in-person instruction, to really incorporate all of the learning that happened this year. How are we thinking about our digital resources? How are we meeting those macronutrients for every child and building out what it takes to see every child able to grow and learn in that classroom setting? And, or if you want to have more information, contact me, or if you've heard something today, reach out to me, ajacobs@learningovations.com. As a former school principal and teacher, special ed teacher, I know that you've got a lot on your plate, and sometimes it just helps talking to somebody directly as opposed to trying to navigate all the information on your own. So I'm here for you. I can help you as a support. Take the framework analysis, and we've got 2 minutes left. So if anybody has specific questions, if you want to see some of the awesome models that Genevieve has developed with Fontana and how they're building out their equity in classrooms for next year, we can definitely go back and look at that. Genevieve, do you want to hop back in and just show examples until we've got about 1.5, 2 minutes here?
Yeah, I think one of the places where teachers really was where they wanted to focus on was their asynchronous work. And I know that you haven't seen a demo of what A2I looks like, but this is how after the students take the assessment, the teacher is given a group with grade equivalency and then amount of time that they should be spending with that group in meaning focused or like comprehension and vocabulary, and then code focused. And so this is an example of how we coach teachers on how to intentionally assign work to students. So because this group needed more code focus or phonics and phonemic awareness, they assigned way more phonics activities for this group. And then their may do was a few of the meaning focused activities. So I think in previous years, like this specific teacher wasn't even differentiating the work that the students were doing independently. And now they're using the recommendations to number one, assign grade equivalent, like appropriate grade equivalent activities, and then making sure like the amount of time the student was spending in code focus was appropriate to what was recommended on the platform. So that's one way they did it asynchronously. They even turned that menu digitally. Another way is just, again, on the amount of time that's recommended for the groups. So we have some groups that need a lot of time with the teacher. And so that's how this teacher decided whether they were going to see the group more often throughout the week. And then say group 5 doesn't need that much time in code focus with a teacher. So the teacher was able to schedule that group less. But it doesn't mean that they have, it still means that they're meeting with a teacher, but now because they're meeting on appropriate grade equivalent material to that group doesn't need to spend that much time face to face with a teacher, but more time applying that work on their own. So those are just a few examples of how we help coach teachers use the recommendations in planning their school day.